In this session on appraisals, we're going to talk about the comparison method of appraisal and the cost approach to appraisal. So, when appraisers make appraisals, there are actually three different approaches that appraisers can take. The first is called the market data, also known as the comparison approach. The second is the cost approach, and the third is the income approach. And we're going to look at all three of these. In this session, we'll do the market data approach and the cost approach, and in another session, we'll do the income approach. So let's talk about the market data approach, again also called the comparison method, because what's happening here is the appraiser is comparing the subject property. By the subject property, I mean the property that is being appraised. He or she is comparing that subject property to other comparable properties, other properties as similar as possible to the subject property. So in order to have an appraisal where the market data approach is really valid, we have to have a lot of buyers and sellers. We have to have data. And of course, in residential property, the sale and purchase of homes is where we have most of the data. All right, and the appraiser always likes to use what are called arm's length sales. Now, we defined an arm's length transaction earlier in another session as one between a buyer who was looking to get the best buy and a seller who was looking to get the best price and terms in the sale of the property. And typically, when an appraiser uses the market data approach, he or she would like to use at least three comparables as a minimum number of comps. So just visualize an appraisal process whereby the appraiser looks at the subject property and then goes out and seeks similar properties in the area that are comparable and utilizes them to appraise the existing property. Now, since rarely are two properties identical, the appraiser will have to make some adjustments. And the adjustments are always made. Please make a note for yourself. The adjustments are always made in the comparables, not in the subject. So you never adjust the subject, you adjust the comparables to bring them in line with the subject property. And adjustments are made, of course, when there are changes. So the first adjustment that we're going to talk about here is the date of sale, or a time adjustment. So let's take a hypothetical appraisal. And here you see the subject property where we're not even concerned, we're trying to appraise it, so we don't have a sales price. But we have three other comparables, let's say in the same neighborhood. And they sold, comp 1 sold for $250,000, comp 2 sold for $238,000, and comp 3 sold for $270,000. Now, those are market prices. Those are actual amounts that those three comparable properties sold for. But one of them sold 3 months ago and another one sold 6 months ago. And the first one, comp 1, is a recent sale. So an adjustment for date of sale would not be necessary on the recent transaction, but comparable 2 sold 3 months ago. And the presumption in this example is that we have a relatively rapidly appreciating market. So in this particular example, and again, this is just hypothetical, 3 months ago, that property that sold 3 months ago for $238,000 would probably sell for a greater amount today. And the appraiser uses his or her expertise to say, okay, in that 3-month period, we should adjust that property because of the rapid rate of appreciation in the neighborhood. We should adjust that property by $5,000. Similarly, for comp number 3, which sold 6 months ago, the appraiser in this example, again, and just an example, is making an adjustment of $9,000. In other words, if that $270,000 property, which sold 6 months ago, were to sell today, it would sell for $279,000. So that's the date of sale adjustment. Now, the second adjustment the appraiser might make is for location. So in our example, the subject property has a typical or average location for the neighborhood, as did comp 1. but comp 2 also had an average location. But comp 3 had an above average location, maybe because comp 3 had a much superior view to the other comps and to the subject property. So what the appraiser is saying then, if comp 3 was on an average lot, would it have sold for more or less than it did sell for? Now, let me say that again. The question the appraiser asks is, if comparable 3 was on an average lot, would it have sold for more or less than it did? And the answer is, if it was on an average lot, it would have sold for less than it did. So what the appraiser then does is adjusts the sales price of comp 3 downward. How much? Well, again, that's a judgment call for the appraiser. But in our example, we're saying that the appraiser is going to adjust it by $10,000. In other words, if comp 3 was on an average lot, instead of selling for $270, it might have sold only for $260. Now, the third adjustment that might be made is for financing. And remember, adjustments are only made when things are different from each other. So in this situation, in all three comps, the buyers got new loans. So it was brand new financing. And the subject property is going to sell with new financing. So since there's no difference, no adjustment is made for financing. The fourth adjustment is for condition or features. And most of the adjustments on a real appraisal are here. Block wall versus no fence or chain link fence. Air conditioning versus a swamp cooler. A swimming pool versus no swimming pool, and so on. So let's take a look at our three comps. Well, the subject property in our example has a pool. Comp 1 had no pool, Comp 2 no pool, Comp 3 had a pool. So keeping in line with the idea that when things are the same, we don't make an adjustment, there's no adjustment for Comp 3. But Comp 1 with no pool, question, if Comp 1 had a pool, would it have sold for more or less than it did sell for? And the answer is it would have sold for more. Now, and the same is true for comp number 2. So in both of these situations, the appraiser is going to adjust these upward. And again, the number picked here is $12,000. Please realize that even though a pool might cost $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 to install, you rarely get that extra or full value for that pool. Now, the last adjustment that we might make here is for special conditions of the sale. So, for example, we have no special condition on the subject and none on Comp 1, but Comp 2, the appraiser knew was an estate sale. And generally speaking, estate sales will probably sell at less than actual market value. So knowing this particular fact, the appraiser is going to say to himself or herself, well, it sold for $238, but it was an estate sale. So it's likely that if it was not an estate sale, it would have sold for more. The appraiser then adjusts that upward, again in this example, by $10,000. And then on the bottom line here, we then total the adjustments for the comps. So Comp 1, which sold for $250, but it didn't have a pool, so we adjusted it upward. Now we're saying that that property should have sold for, or would have sold, or to bring in a line, I should say, with the subject property, is $262. And Comp 2, we have an adjustment for date of sale, and we have an adjustment for a pool, and we have an adjustment for an estate sale. So instead of $238, the appraiser is now saying $265. And on Comp 3, we have a positive adjustment for the date of sale, but a negative adjustment for the fact that it had an above average lot. And that brings us to $269 as an adjusted value for Comp 3. So how do we now apply this to the subject property? Well, you can see in this analysis, as compared to the original or actual sales prices of these properties, these three are now more in line with each other, ranging from $262 up to $269. So the appraiser will not just add all three of these together and divide by 3 to average them. What the appraiser would then ask himself or herself is, which of these three comps is actually the closest to the subject property? And the answer to that question is generally, well, the comp that has the fewest adjustments is the most comparable to the subject property. So in this example, the one that has the fewest, which is comp number 1, is the most comparable, and it's more likely that the appraiser would estimate the value of the subject to be closer to 262 than it would to 269. But the final decision on what the subject property is worth is made by the appraiser. And remember, an appraisal is simply an opinion of value. So with the market data approach, we can see that because we need data, the market data approach is going to be relied on most heavily in the sale or the appraisal of existing homes. Because with residential property, we have, generally speaking, a large amount of similarity between properties, and also we have a lot of data. In addition to existing homes, when appraising vacant land, an appraiser would rely most heavily on the market data approach. Remember, vacant land, there's no improvements, so the amount of adjustments that might be made would be many fewer, maybe for location and maybe for financing, but other than that, we would typically not have adjustments for vacant land. So that's the market data approach.